Airbus. It's hard to imagine an aviation world without Airbus these days. It seems like it's always been that way, but no. The strange international cooperation could have disappeared before it created its equally strange plane, which almost destroyed it too. But it was these strange things that started the revolution that gave birth not only to the aviation giant, but also to the image of modern air travel. Hello aviators, Sky here, and I present to you the beginning of it all, the Airbus A300. And it all started with a crisis, systemic and all-encompassing. The European aviation industry has always had a serious base, creating engineering masterpieces. The de Havilland Comet became the first jet airliner in the world. The Sud Aviation Caravelle gave rise to the still popular layout with engines in the tail. This continued, but oddly enough, with each subsequent model, the situation of aircraft manufacturers was getting worse. And it wasn't about engineering, but about economics. The creation of increasingly complex aircraft was becoming too expensive, and local companies could barely pull them off. And even having made an excellent machine, they entered the fragmented European market, pushing each other there. In a situation where several similar aircraft entered the market at once, one could be sure that none of them would ultimately pay off. And the colleagues from overseas were also pressing this problem from above. The huge US market, both civilian and military, allowed its manufacturers to increase production and reduce the cost of aircraft, which is why they were on average 10 to 15% cheaper than their European counterparts. It was difficult to fight this. While the Caravelle felt good, the Hawker Trident was inferior to the Boeing 727, and the Vickers VC-10, no matter how technologically advanced it was simply crushed by the Boeing 707. And the Europeans already in the 1960s realized that either they would do something about it, or soon their aircraft would only be seen in museums. By this point, serious changes had come to the air travel industry itself. Passenger traffic was growing at a frantic pace, and the infrastructure simply could not cope. In order to somehow relieve the airports, airlines demanded new planes that would either fly faster to increase the frequency of transportation or be larger to accommodate more passengers. The answer to these demands was a leap of airliners beyond the sound barrier. The legendary race of the Soviet Tu-144, the American Boeing Tu-707, and the Anglo-French Concorde began. Supersonic did not justify itself, but led to an interesting conclusion. Note, the Anglo-French Concorde. Two aircraft manufacturers from two countries may not spoil each other's lives, but on the contrary cooperate in the implementation of a real mega project. Yes, the mega project was not successful, but the cooperation worked. And while speed was facing problems, size became interesting. There was a real breakthrough in power plant technology. Large turbofan engines with their huge bypass ducts and power appeared. For example, while the old Pratt & Whitney JT3D from Boeing 707 squeezed out 17,000 pounds force of thrust, the new JT9D produced as much as 56,000 pounds force. In the mid-1960s, this figure seemed simply wild. Seeing the gigantic potential of such power plants, the military began to create gigantic aircraft, like the C-5 Galaxy. And airlines, having seen this whale, demanded the creation of its passenger relative. Work on real titans quickly began within the walls of Boeing, Douglas, and Lockheed, and the phrase wide-body airliner began to be heard more and more often in the industry. The European aircraft manufacturers did not remain on the sidelines of this trend, of course with their own nuances. In Europe, there were many busy but short routes, so the aircraft did not necessarily need a long range. At the same time, they did not want to make giants with 300 to 400 seats like the Americans, leaning towards smaller options with 200 to 250. The combination of these factors allowed for an unusual engineering solution. The plane would be small and light, relatively speaking, and it could be lifted into the sky by 2 engines, not 3 like Douglas and Lockheed, and not 4 like Boeing. Using the best technical achievements, including the Concorde developments, the aircraft manufacturers hoped to make the machine modern and inexpensive, and the concept also allowed them to avoid direct competition with the Americans. they had already tried it, and they didn't like it. There were many projects, some very exotic, like the wide Nordaviation N600 and the double-deck Breguet BR-124, and some more familiar to us, like the Sudaviation Galion and Hawker Siddeley HS-134. Actually, it was then, in the early 1960s, that the phrase European Airbus began to emerge. At that time, it was not yet a name, but rather a collective concept of everything they had come up with. Although these projects were more modest than the American ones, it quickly became clear that individual companies could not handle them. Encouraged by their governments and inspired by the experience of working together on the Concorde, they began to cooperate. And now it was not just about the France-UK pair, but about a broader approach. Germany had to be involved as well. The French, the British, and the Germans? Together? Yes, it was 1964. World War II was well remembered, and it was fashionable among experts to bet on how soon such unprecedented cooperation would fall apart. But things were going better than many expected. The French saw cooperation as an opportunity to become more powerful. The British were hesitant, believing they could handle it themselves, but the government pushed for cooperation despite criticism. The German aviation industry combined post-war depression with the desire to get back into the big game, so they greeted the idea with enthusiasm. The Germans consolidated their industry by creating the Arbeitsgemeinschaft Airbus Group, which they later renamed Deutsche Airbus, so that, the partners could pronounce it. The French and British companies also formed several groups that proposed joint ideas. The closest to reality were the HBN 100 and Galion projects, which became the basis for the future Airbus Firstborn. But the story was just beginning. Despite the fact that the general concept had been chosen, there was a real war over the details. Airlines wanted a capacity of 350 seats. The British wanted to see their Rolls-Royce engines under the wing. And what's more, it was even necessary to decide what language the work would be done in, and what units of measurement to use. It was decided that the main language would be English, because it was more common, and imperial measurements because most airlines were already accustomed to working with feet and miles. The base engine on the plane was to be the Rolls-Royce RB207, and the capacity was chosen as a compromise, 300 seats. 2 engines would not be able to lift more. Actually, this is where the Airbus 300 or A300 index of the airliner came from. In 1967, Sudaviation, Hawker Siddeley, and Deutsche Airbus signed a Memorandum of Understanding. The Dutch Fokker also joined as a contractor. And then the wave of enthusiasm crashed into problems. First, it turned out that the plane was too heavy for the RB207, and Rolls-Royce began to clearly pay more attention to the RB211, oriented towards Boeing and Lockheed aircraft. The French began to shift the focus towards the Dassault Mercure airliner. And then airlines began to doubt the range of the plane, becoming more interested in long-range trijets. The A300 had to be saved before it was even born. The capacity for the sake of range was rolled back to 250 seats, and it was decided to use American engines, the General Electric CF6 or Pratt & Whitney JT9D. London's patience snapped because of this, and it left the project, deciding to make its own plane. It seemed that this would be the end of it, but France and Germany declared that they would continue the project together, having enlisted the support of Hawker Siddeley, who eventually agreed to make a wing for the plane, as was planned earlier. On December 18, 1970, Airbus Industrie GIE was created. A year later, Spain joined the consortium. Airbus is a consortium of aircraft manufacturers from several countries. The organizational structure created an unusual production chain. Factories scattered throughout Europe made parts that were transferred to final assembly in Toulouse by road, river, and air. But the unusual things continued. Airbus is a consortium of aircraft manufacturers, not just local contractors, but large companies that could make entire planes themselves. Therefore, not just parts, but practically finished sections, already equipped and tested, were being driven around Europe. In addition, they had to arrive in Toulouse exactly when needed, no earlier and no later, which made the A300 one of the first babies of the so-called just-in-time manufacturing, a key aspect of lean production which all companies are now obsessed with. On the one hand, this required the highest level of synchronization of work. On the other, this greatly simplified assembly. Of the total labor cost, final assembly accounted for about 4 to 5%. While the big bosses were dividing up roles, the engineers were doing their job. Already in 1972, the first prototype was presented to the public. The plane was rolled out of the hangar with a great fanfare and placed opposite the Concorde. Beautiful. Finally, on October 28, 1972, the Airbus A300 version B1 with the tail number FWUAB took off from the runway of Toulouse-Blagnac Airport. The first twin-engine wide-body airliner in the world, and the very first Airbus aircraft made its maiden flight. All the project participants congratulated each other and wished Airbus a good journey. At that time, they hardly imagined what kind of journey awaited them. During 1973, 3 more prototypes joined the firstborn. The program was large-scale and complex, but the aircraft performed exceptionally. So following the tests, practically no changes in the design were required. Some elements were even simplified. The first Airbus airliner to take to the skies was the basic A300 B1. I think we can start the description of the aircraft with it. The Airbus A300 is the founder of the design that we would now call a classic example of a wide-body airliner. A low-wing plane with 2 engines suspended under a low-sweep wing, a single-fin tail, and a tricycle landing gear. Length 51 meters, wingspan 44.8 meters. Among wide-body planes, it is the smallest, only slightly larger than the Boeing 707. Given the struggle between the weight and thrust of just 2 engines, engineers paid a lot of attention to making the aircraft lighter. The design was optimized as much as possible, and some elements were made of composite materials, for the first time on a civil airliner. This yielded results. The maximum takeoff weight was only 120 tons. Even the Boeing 707 was heavier. The wing, pride of Hawker Siddeley, was distinguished by its great aerodynamics. The sweep angle was small, only 28 degrees. The aircraft turned out to be quite slow, 457 knots cruise, but worked better at a wide range of speeds, including landing. The high-lift devices are advanced: 3 sections of slats, 3 sections of retractable flaps, and 2 pairs of ailerons, plus a bunch of spoilers and air brakes. The controversy of choosing a power plant ended funny. The Europeans and the Americans swapped places. Rolls-Royce won the Lockheed contract for the engine for the L1011, and the losers, General Electric, went to Airbus, offering them their GE CF6. Over time, the CF6 began to be assembled in France at Snecma plants, with participation of the German MTU. This cooperation developed, and over time grew into CFM International. The base aircraft was equipped with the CF6-50A engine, with a thrust of 22.2 tons force. In the tail section of the fuselage, an auxiliary power unit from Garrett was installed. The engines were fed from a fuel system that included 2 pairs of tanks in the wing, holding approximately 35 tons of fuel. All this provided the aircraft with a range of 2,130 kilometers, which is just nothing. But it was assumed that on short routes it would be enough. Spoiler alert, it wasn't. The landing gear of the airliner is classic: 3 legs, the front 2-wheel, the main gear 2 legs with 4-wheeled bogies. Again, simpler than that of its heavier brothers. The L1011 somehow managed to stand on 3 legs, but the DC-10 got 4, not to mention the 747, which has as many as 5. The first question for any wide-body aircraft is how wide is its fuselage? Engineers calculated this issue back when they were creating the HBN 100 and Galion, and came up with a diameter of 5.64 meters, the intersection of aerodynamics, cabin capacity, and luggage compartments. It turned out to be extremely successful and has not changed for decades. The A310, A330, and A340 all have the same diameter. The 5.28 meters wide cabin provided a good variety of layouts: 6 to 7 seats in a row in first and business class, 8 seats in economy class, and 9 seats maximum. In normal, mixed configurations, the base airliner accommodated 220 seats, about 250 in a single-class layout and 302 in a dense one. The technology allowed this, although the passengers of course would not be thankful. The cabin usually had 3 to 4 kitchens and 6 lavatories. The A300 air conditioning system is divided into 4 zones, 3 in the cabin and 1 in the cockpit, plus ventilation of equipment and luggage compartments. The 2 cargo compartments below are designed for suitcases and containers. In fact, the fuselage diameter was selected, among other things, to accommodate a pair of LD3 containers side by side. There are 10 doors, 3 pairs of passenger doors, 1 pair of emergency doors, plus 2 cargo doors below. Let's take a closer look at the nose. The cockpit glazing was in line with the trends, wide but minimalistic, without those complex interlocking structures with a bunch of small windows. The cockpit was designed for 3, 2 pilots and a flight engineer. It incorporated all the achievements of its time. The avionics were analog, but received all the modern automation and functionality. The aircraft in the base could operate according to the second category of instrument landing system, and optionally it was possible to reach category 3, with minimal visibility, for example in fog. The level of Boeing 747 and DC-10. The L-1011 was cooler, but there Lockheed really invested everything. The main systems compartment was locked under the cockpit and could be accessed from here through the hatch in the floor. The aircraft was controlled by a network of mechanical drives connected to 3 independent hydraulic systems, and in front of the pilots were classic yokes, old school. The Airbus family feature, side sticks, appeared only in the mid-1980s on the A320 with its fly-by-wire control system. The irony of the Airbus A300 B1 description is that this option quickly lost its relevance. Air France considered that 220-250 seats were too few and demanded an increase. Calculations showed that it was quite possible to do this. Airbus lengthened the fuselage and increased the capacity, 281 in a single class and 345 maximum. The plane became considerably heavier, but optimized design allowed it to maintain performance, and General Electric installed boosted engines on it. Thus, the aircraft gained not only capacity but also range, 3,240 kilometers. This is how the A300 B2 appeared. By the way, they started creating it at the early stages of the project, so in the flock of flight prototypes, 2 planes already were the B2 versions. However, negotiations with airlines one way or another came down to the same thing: range. Trying to solve this problem, Airbus began making the B3 version, based on the small B1, but the same airlines were against it: insufficient capacity. They had to act more radically. They took the large B2 version as a base, installed another tank in the center section, and also did a trick with the high-lift devices, installing small Kruger flaps near the center section, which were supposed to help in hot and high-altitude conditions. The plane became heavier again, but the engines catching up continued to increase thrust, the glorious modernization potential of the CF6. This is how the Airbus A300 B4 appeared, the range of which over time reached 6,290 kilometers. Finally, in 1971, Air France with great fanfare signed a contract for 6 aircraft, later joined by Lufthansa, 3 aircraft, and Iberia, 4 aircraft. The order portfolio, well, I wouldn't say wow. In 1973, the airliner was sent on a tour of the Western Hemisphere, from Sao Paulo to Montreal. And behind all these demonstration flights, inspirational speeches, and a sea of champagne, there was a problem for Airbus. No one believed in their airliner. What is the A300 anyway? Low capacity, low range, low speed, 2 engines, which means low ETOPS. Such aircraft had to always be close to alternate airfields in case of a failure of one engine. That is, it couldn't fly, for example, across the ocean. 3- and 4-engine competitors were more spacious, could fly far and at the same time on any route. And what is Airbus itself? Some kind of political initiative of European officials. The A300 had only 3 customers, and even then someone could say that the countries participating in the project asked their operators to buy a few units out of decency. And then, in the early 1970s, the oil crisis sent fuel prices soaring, choking air travel. Airlines had no desire to take risks. The American tour brought no orders, and Airbus continued to fly their planes around the world, desperately looking for customers. Incidentally, such a rapid creation of a bunch of versions also speaks of desperation. The manufacturer was ready to adjust the planes to airlines just so they would buy them. The most important stage of the promotion was the completion of tests in 1974, when the A300 finally received the coveted certificates. The basic version A300B1 never went into production, being limited in fact to 2 prototypes, and the A300B2 was the first to enter the market. And then it got interesting. Air France, the launch operator, put the planes on short but busy routes between European cities, and it quickly became apparent that the A300 were doing just fine. They were simple, economical, and didn't even suffer from any minor initial flaws, even strange for a completely new model. Airlines from Asia to Africa began to show cautious interest in the 300, but orders were still very modest. Production stagnated. This entire gigantic infrastructure with factories all over Europe produced 1 or 2 aircraft per month. From the end of 1975 until the summer of 1977, there were no sales at all. The planes were simply being made for the warehouse. A horror. Bets on how long the consortium would last became fashionable again. Airbus desperately needed large orders. The siege of the key market, the USA, was very difficult, but there, Airbus finally met eyes with Eastern Airlines. One of the American majors was already operating in the Lockheed TriStar and wanted something a step lower, between the L-1011 and Boeing 727, for short, busy routes. Air France's experience seemed interesting to them. The problem was that the airline was afraid to immediately take on aircraft that were not familiar to it. Airbus came up with a trick. They gave them several aircraft for operational tests, essentially on free lease, with the option of subsequent purchase if the A300 proved itself. And prove itself it did. It proved itself so well that a year later, Eastern ordered 23 airliners with an option for 9 more. It was a breakthrough. It's hard to imagine how much champagne was drunk in Toulouse in those days. Moreover, Eastern's operating experience became famous, and the airliner began to be purchased much more actively, both in the US and the rest of the world. The industry saw that the A300 was not just technically good. The attitude towards the concept itself turned 180 degrees. The airliner was very flexible in operation. It was much less demanding of airfields and easily fit into the existing infrastructure. Even the lack of range played into the aircraft's hands. The Giants were great for long-haul flights between hubs, but on many short and medium-haul routes it was simply unprofitable to use them. The A300 worked there easily, bringing in great profits for its owners. The same was true for the purchase price of the aircraft and their operating costs. They were cheaper than their competitors in all respects. And while the exorbitant cost of the Boeing 747 could still be justified by its Royal Highness, the Trijets had problems. The third engine is not just an addition to the 2 under the wing. It's an entire system squeezed into a complex design, the modification and maintenance of which is a whole thing. Fuel consumption was 30% less than even the newest L-1011, not to mention the older aircraft. And there was still a crisis. Fuel was very expensive, and those 30% were very tempting. Meanwhile, the advantages were erased. The reliability of the airliner allowed ETOPS to be eased, and in 1977, the A300 received an ETOPS 90 certificate. That is, it could be 1.5 hours away from the alternate airfields. This opened up many long-haul routes for it. Yes, the TriStar and DC-10 were superior to the A300, but looking at all the factors, were they that superior? An ironic situation arose. Chasing each other, Lockheed, Boeing, and McDonnell Douglas made large, luxurious, and long-range airliners, but frankly overlooked the market of small and medium routes with large passenger flows, as it turned out a gigantic market. And in this gigantic market, the A300 found itself practically alone. Production and delivery volumes soared, while in 1978, Airbus produced 15 aircraft, in 1980 there were 39, and in 1982, 46. Yes, these numbers now don't seem impressive, but I repeat, this was the time when mentioning Airbus, it was necessary to explain who they were. Corporate games began. The Americans started offering various joint projects, and the British changed their attitude towards Airbus. In 1979, the British Aircraft Corporation returned to the consortium's share. Just like that, you sit and work in solitude and censure, and as soon as you start getting rich, everyone immediately wants to be friends with you. Modifications continued, expanding the aircraft's capabilities and options. Airlines could now hang under the wing not only the General Electric CF6, but also the Pratt & Whitney JT9D. But this was not enough. Boeing, catching up with its competitor, began work on its own twin-engine wide-body airliner. Airbus, preparing to meet the Boeing 767, took a step forward by initiating the A300 B10 project. The step was big. Many elements and systems were redesigned. The aircraft got a glass cockpit with displays and a two-member crew without a flight engineer in the early 1980s. And the power plant was chosen between the updated GE CF6-80 and the PW4000 series, completely new. The aircraft was shortened and its capacity reduced, but the range was extended to 9,540 kilometers. It finally became a long-haul aircraft. The B-10 was updated so much that it deserved a new index. Thus, in 1982, the Airbus A310 took to the skies for the first time. The A300, however, was not going to be written off. It didn't fly as far, but was more spacious. First, the A300 B4-200FFCC, or Forward-Facing Crew Cockpit, was created, which remained analog but got rid of the flight engineer. And then came the time for more radical improvements. The design was optimized, the fuselage was made slightly longer and more capacious. The engines were updated, starting to install new versions, like the A310. The amount of composites were increased, and the high-lift devices were optimized, removing the low-speed ailerons. Curious. And the cherry on top were the first winglets. They were modest, not like now, but reduced fuel consumption by 1.5%. The cockpit was redesigned using the A310's developments. 2 pilots, a glass cockpit, new ergonomics. Even Porsche engineers were involved in the project. The battle for fuel capacity continued. Tanks appeared in the tail stabilizer, and another optional tank in the belly. Thus, in 1983, the world saw the Airbus A300-600 and A300-600R. They could reach 7,500 kilometers of range, and achieved even greater relaxation of restrictions on such flights. ETOPS 180. Fly practically as you want. Airbus has been working on cargo variants since the very beginning, which is why they adjusted the fuselage to fit containers. At first, their ideas were of little interest, but by the 1990s, when old passenger versions began to be cheaply converted into cargo planes, they became a hit. And this was another goldmine. I will only say that logistics leaders such as UPS and FedEx still operate more than 100 A300-600Fs. One of the A300 modifications became part of its own production line. To transport large aircraft parts, Airbus used 4 chubby super guppies with huge fuselages, made on the basis of the Boeing Stratofreighters. The guys from Seattle even laughed at this, saying that Airbus makes its planes using Boeing planes. But in the 1980s, this was no longer enough. Something larger, more powerful, and faster was needed. There were even ideas to lease a C-5 and Un-124, but they were abandoned, too expensive, and you can't put a piece of fuselage on top of the Galaxy. As a result, the logistics department turned to their own colleagues with a proposal. Since you love the A300 modifications so much, make us one too. The idea was simple. Take the A300-600R and apply the super guppy concept to it, making it a super wide-body aircraft. Thus was created the A300-600ST, Super Transporter, which received the well-known name Beluga. The modification, in fact, was not so radical. The aircraft was 80% a regular 600R, with a huge fuselage put on it and a modified tail unit. The first aircraft took off in 1994, after which 5 new Belugas replaced the veteran Super Guppies. With the new aircraft, the speed of transportation more than doubled. Flying whales with fuselages as big as 7.4 meters in diameter and a payload capacity of 47 tons could transport most of the large components, including long fuselage sections and wing panels of even the A340, and sometimes worked on the side. Why not take advantage of uniqueness? And another application of the A300 was found in the space industry. At the request of the European Space Agency and its partners, one aircraft was modified for astronaut training. The plane gains altitude and then goes into a dive, simulating weightlessness inside. Thus, from 1997 to 2014, the A300 Zero-G was jumping around in the sky. Unfortunately, having taken its place among the top airliners, the A300 also took its place in the incident rating. During its operation up to the present time, the A300 has been involved in about 100 incidents, disasters and hijackings, which 1,435 people and 24 aircraft did not survive. Depressing figures, but if you look at it cynically, they did not stand out from the general statistics. In the 1990s, demand for the A300 began to decline. While in 1993 they delivered 44 units, in 1995, 19. The aircraft was becoming outdated, and it was getting difficult for it to compete with its American counterpart, the Boeing 767. Airbus, having brought the new A320 to series production, returned to its firstborn with a new plan. Back in the 1970s, they were working on 2 projects, the smaller A300B10, which became the A310, and the larger A300B9, which was able to compete with the DC-10 and L-1011. At that time, the project stalled. The technology was not developed enough. But now, everything changed. The B9 was relaunched, received an extended fuselage, a new wing, engines and equipment, and in 1992 it took to the air. This is how the world saw the Airbus A330. And the successor lived up to all expectations, became extremely successful, and is still being produced. We can also add to this the A300B11, a project for an even larger 4-engine long-haul aircraft, which in the 1990s gave rise to, yes, the Airbus A340. And Grandpa was slowly retiring, leaving the production line in 2007. A total of 561 aircraft were assembled, of which about 170 are still flying and even being modernized. The A300 was an intersection of several rare phenomena. Despite the fact that Airbus had just appeared, they managed to preserve and strengthen their competences and ultimately create a wonderful airliner. And they guessed right with a risky concept. The twin-engine wide-body airliner layout outlived its competitors and became the standard. Look at the apron of any modern airport. Most of the big guys there are its successors. Airbus itself received a powerful springboard for development. It was on the basis of the A300 that the A310, A330 and A340 were created. And it was with the money for its sales that the A320 was created, the current leader of medium-haul transportation. In 1974, Airbus delivered the 4th airliner of its production to the customer, and it was a celebration. In 2024, in a routine manner, they handed over another aircraft, the 8658. Now, the consortium occupies half or even more than half of the market of mainline aircraft, having become in fact the world leader in civilian aircraft manufacturing. And now the Americans have to catch up to the Europeans. If I had said this in the 1970s, I would have been taken for a madman. The twists and turns of fate. This is where we can end the long story. Like and subscribe to the channel so as not to miss the continuation. Fast flights on successful planes and soft landings to you.